My dear friends, I'm coming to you with this video to address the recent outbreak of an outburst of different lies and mistruths that the Russian authorities are spreading about Georgian history, namely about Russia-Georgia relations. The reason and the excuse for this bunch of lies and bunch of misinformation and disinformation was given by one of our Georgian TV presenters, Georgi Gabunia, who works for a private media company, Urdhebe 2, and he, in one of his night shows, just sweared at Putin, and that took a lot of discussion in the Russian government somehow. Of course, we might consider it unethical, a bit ugly, inappropriate, so on and so forth, but still it is a freedom of expression of an individual, professional, belonging and working for a private entity. And it's a bit surprising that it took really a national controversy, especially in Russia, and gained so much response, which in a way is good because it means that Russian authorities do care about what is being said in Georgia, and we are an important issue, quote unquote, for them. However, I still have to and need to address some of the lies that have been spreaded, especially about Georgian and Russian relations. Our relationship started in 12th, 13th centuries when our queen, or King Tamar, we call her king because of her contribution to the Georgian statehood and state building, and she was so important, and she was a ruler herself, not a ruler's wife, and this is why we refer to her as if we would have referred to a male king. She was married, her first husband was Russian from one of their principalities. His name was Yuri Bogolubsky, and he turned out to be gay and also a zoophile, and many other different sexual interests that he had were discovered and revealed later on. They were divorced, obviously, because of that. And then he tried to start a rebellion, even to restore himself in powers of Queen's husband. So sort of our relationship started with the lie and the violence. Obviously, the Georgians who were soliciting this marriage were misled and misinformed, perhaps. And after that, right up until 16th, 17th century, we had nothing to do with Russia at all, which again suggests and crushes the second myth, according to which that we have no alternative but somehow cooperating with Russia and somehow getting along, because for so many centuries we somehow have survived without it. And coming back to this situation with the marriage, have to point out that a lot of times the pro-Russian propagandists are suggesting that the West, Europe, and the US are importing LGBT people in Georgia and installing them here, while actually it turns out that the first famous gay was really imported from one of the Russian feudal principalities. In the 17th and 16th centuries, our kings of different kingdoms and principalities tried to re-establish some relationships with Russian authorities back then, because there was this feeling that yes, they shared religious beliefs with us, so there was hope that they would help us to survive against other empires, namely the Persian and Ottoman empires. But at that point, when we started knocking on Russian door, Russia was still in a state of forming its statehood, and therefore they sort of did not have time for us. But when that door opened, it really hit us on the head, and we still are in the process of trying to recover from this hit. Since then, right up until the 18th century, there were a lot of smaller or bigger treaties and agreements concluded between different Georgian principalities, different Russian monarchs, but many of them were really violated by the Russian monarchy. For example, when Peter I, an Empire of Russia, planned his trip and his military campaign against Persia or Iran, he secured as an ally one of our kings, and then and obviously our king put up his people and sort of started the war in the hope that the Russians would join in. But then the Peter's plans changed and that never happened, so few Georgian fighters were left in the face of who knows however many hundreds of thousands of Iranian forces. After that, in 1770, there was another big combat with the Ottomans this time, when again Russian authorities and General Totlaban promised help and just then left with the Russian troops the battlefield, leaving Georgians again alone in the face of the Ottomans. After this, still, the contract of Georgievsk was concluded in 1783, according to which it was a collective defense treaty, according to which if the Georgian state was in some kind of emergency or under threat of invasion, the Russians were intended and were to help with the defense. In return, a Georgian patriarch was equalized to the seventh degree of the Russian religious hierarchy. So he was hierarchically declared lower than the Russia's patriarch at a time. Also, Georgia had still, and Georgian state of Kartkacheti, it's Eastern Georgia now, had still some independence in internal affairs, and the crown would to be kept and not replaced by anything. Still, in 1795, Tbilisi was burned to ground by the Persians, and Russian forces never have helped. Personally, I believe after this violation of the contract of Georgievsk, it should have been just burned somewhere and completely destroyed, because it was systematically violated. Essentially, it seemed like Russian authorities were really waiting for the Georgian states to completely be weakened and destroyed, which then would provide them safe haven to enter and annex. Which really happened in 1801 when last king of Kartkacheti, George XII, died mysteriously. Allegedly, he was poisoned by maybe some agents of the Russian Empire, but this is not proved. The Russian authorities, as an excuse, said that they are returning some icon of a saint that was lost from the Georgian church, and they said that they found it and would return it, and there was huge celebration of this in Sioni church in Tbilisi, and obviously all the nobility came over, and they were surrounded by the Russian troops in that church, and essentially under the weapons they were demanded to renounce and to deny the Georgian kingdom and to sort of say their vows to the Russian Empire. And after this, Georgia became just a mere province of the Russian Empire, split into several regions. Georgian language was throughout the whole 19th and the first beginning of the 20th century was very much fought against. The schooling in Georgian was not provided. They banned Orthodox religious services in Georgian and allowed them to be only in Russian. Georgian fresks, which are paintings on the church walls, were painted with white, were covered, because it's not in Russian tradition to paint the walls of the churches. It's actually, the 19th century is a time when the ethnic divisions between Georgian and Abkhaz people were also sort of started, and the first seeds of that were planted. In Georgia declared its independence after the revolution of February 1917 in Russia, and later after the coup d'etat of that very year in October, meaning the Bolshevik coup d'etat. Georgia declared its independence, which on May of the 7th of 1920 was recognized by the Russia. So on May the 7th of 1920, the Socialist Russia recognized Georgia's independence and sovereignty. And then in about 9 months or so, they themselves have occupied it again in February of 1921. Yes, so the Red Army entered Georgia. With Georgian authorities were requesting Moscow and asking them for some official explanations, but they never gave any, and then the Georgian government was exiled. There was never any peace treaty according to which they never concluded any peace treaty according to which the Georgian state would give up its independence. Therefore, it was a pure occupation. I will not talk a lot and in detail about severe repressions that followed, especially in 1930s when tens of thousands of Georgians were killed and executed, transferred to Siberia and other places. It was mainly intellectuals, people who had opinions, thinkers, scientists, doctors, film directors, famous actors, ballet and musicians, all people who are necessary and who contribute a lot to the community development. And then there was World War II, to which Georgia has lost 1/10 of its population, namely 350,000 people. It's more than the US has lost to the war. It's about the same proportion as what Germany lost to the war. If we consider that Germany was one of the sides of the war and the war would take place on its territory and so on and so forth. Out of 3.5 million people who lived in Georgia, 700,000 were called to serve and to fight in the war, so 1/5 of our population, and half of them died. So every second of those who went to the war died. Therefore, Georgia lost now its bravest part of the population, who did not run away from the war, who did not escape their duty. Now they were destroyed as well. Then there was 1956, where when 150 protesters were shot dead in Tbilisi on March the 9th, when they tried to occupy the post building. Well, in the US, there were a lot of sit-ins and occupations of different buildings and seizures of different buildings. It was a normal part of a civic process. And imagine the US government then calling up for its military to shoot people dead out of those buildings. This is what happened here in Georgia. In 1978, the Soviet Moscow decided to ban Georgian as a secondary state language. As we know, in the Soviet Union, each republic had a right to have its own language as one of the state languages, and Russian is another one. So they decided to start this new reform and change and amend Georgian constitution, according to which Georgian would be no longer a language of official communication, of instruction and teaching in universities and schools and so on. And there was a huge peaceful protest against it. On April 9th of 1989 was another tragedy where 21 people, mainly young people, women, minors even, children under 18, were killed. They were all peaceful protesters, and they were killed on the spot with by the soldiers brought directly from Moscow, special force people, and they were armed with axes, and they murdered all of those young people. More were to die as a result of poisonous gas that was also released. I will stop here because then we would be entering the phase of Georgia's restoration of independence and what followed. I will just briefly remind that our current state of affairs, whereby a fifth of Georgian territory is occupied by the Russian forces. Separatism is being encouraged on those territories, and Russian authorities are constantly violating different international treaties regarding Georgia. We have hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons from two wars. One happened in between 1992 and 1994, and another one which was direct Russian intervention in August of 2008. My school, for example, was populated by internally displaced persons. It's the only specialized school for the blind in the country, and we could not start studies at that point because people were simply living there. So there are a lot of mistruths and lies, unfortunately, that the Russian propagandists are trying to install. And this is what we are trying, and obviously their resources are huge, much bigger than ours, but we try through those voluntary actions, such as making this video, to address those lies and to debunk them. All facts that I have named can be found, can be double-checked, and can be researched. Thank you for listening. I hope you will share this, as well as if you are historians, you have been to Georgia, you know other facts or these facts of Georgian history, please also record similar videos and share in your circles. Thanks a lot.